Welcome everybody to our talk today. Thanks so much for coming, and thanks to the people who are joining us online. There are quite a few of you. So I'm so honored today to be here with Dr. Sungmin Cho. But first, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kristi Govella. I'm the director of the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs and an assistant professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii. And today we're delighted to welcome you to this event on Chinese views of North Korea's uncertain future. And it is sponsored by a number of other units as well at UH, including the Center for Chinese Studies, the Center for Korean Studies, the Department of Asian Studies, and the Department of Political Science. So we're all very glad to have Dr. Cho here today. He's a professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, which is a Department of Defense institution here in Hawaii. And he has a number of wonderful accomplishments, but in particular, he's an expert on China-Korean Peninsula relations, North Korea's nuclear program, and US alliances in East Asia. And he's published a number of articles on everything from domestic politics to foreign relations, heavily focused on security, but also things like democracy and domestic institutions. He's also done a lot of work on commentaries from the policy world. So he's definitely someone whose work is very much of interest to contemporary policymakers. Dr. Cho holds a PhD in government from Georgetown, and we're so delighted to have him here today to speak with us. So without further ado, I will hand the floor to Dr. Cho.
Thank you, Kristi. Thank you for the nice introduction, and also I thank Center for China Studies and Korean Studies to co-sponsor this event. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be briefing about my major findings from my research over the last 3 years about China's relationship with North Korea. But before I start, I have to say this: the views expressed in this presentation only represents the personal views of the lecturer, mine, and are not the views of the US Department of Defense or the APCSS. And then the articles that I'm going to present together for this presentation is one is about China's modernization. I mean, how modernization theory applies to China's case. Although the main interest is about the second piece, that why North Korea could not implement the Chinese-style reform and opening. In order to explain that, I also like to spend some time on China's own politics of economic reform, which is the reason why I guess Center for Chinese Studies sponsor this program, this event. And then next, I'll move to the Chinese perspective of the Korean unification, and also why China and the US can cooperate to solve the problem on the Korean Peninsula, actually. So there are some popular assumptions that I like to challenge with my findings. The first assumption is that many Chinese seem to believe that Pyongyang wants to focus on economic development, but it could not because of the sanctions and security threats from the United States. This assumption is very important because that is the main logic of the engagement group, and also for the conservative policy argument that why the message from the conservative to Pyongyang is that once you give up nuclear weapons, then we are all ready to support your economic developments. So why don't you just give up nuclear weapons? And engagement sides say that either way, there is a popular assumption that North Korea wants to and needs to conduct economic reform. And then once given an opportunity, they may well also succeed in economic reform and opening as much as China and Vietnam did. In the world today, there are 4 remaining communist countries: China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. And then Vietnam and China, they successfully conducted economic reform and opening while maintaining the communist system. So Pyongyang, why don't you try? And then once given an opportunity, Kim family regime is well able to also emulate the success experience of Vietnam and China. And the third assumption that I like to challenge is also North Korea is a buffer zone to China. And that's why many people outside China assume that Beijing would rather keep Korean Peninsula divided rather than seeing Korean Peninsula unified under the leadership of South Korea, which also means that unified Korea is likely to remain as a US ally. And Chinese do not want to see that, so they would rather keep Korean Peninsula divided. So to investigate these popular assumptions, this is the topics that my presentation will go through. Again, the main interest is the second part, North Korea, and then comparing North Korea's experience with the Chinese-style reform and opening. But again, to explain that, I'd like to spend some time about the politics of economic reform in China, and then move to contingency scenarios in North Korea, and then how China is likely to respond to some contingency scenarios, mainly the unification of Korea. So in political science, there is a theory called modernization theory, which is very simple and intuitive, that when there is economic development, it is followed by the rise of educational level, urbanization, and there will be more middle class, and people will have more liberal and democratic values, and that provides some energy for the grassroots movement toward democratization. There is a controversy about this theory that economic development does not mean automatically politics will be democratized, but still many scholars argue that at least it increased the likelihood of a political transition. And this theory has been proved with the history of Taiwan and South Korea and many other examples. And also this theory provides theoretical justification for US engagement with China. When Deng Xiaoping announced that we'd like to try economic reform and open, the US officials and scholars, they all welcome and support China's initiative for economic growth because based upon this assumption from modernization theory. And of course, Chinese leaders, they know that when there is economic development, there will be more demand for liberalization and democratization. So when there is the US strategy to support China's economic development, China's counter strategy is to break this causal chain by emphasizing patriotic educational program. So instead of Chinese students are more educated, instead of they want for more liberalization, at the same time, they become more nationalistic and then support the regime. And also middle class, instead of they demand for liberalization, the party's propaganda system also educate the middle class that all this economic miracle was possible because of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So that is what political scientists call the economic performance legitimacy. But it is important to understand that the performance legitimacy not only comes from the economic achievement, but the Chinese Communist Party, they actually invest a lot of resources for governance reform as well. Governance reform, by that I mean Chinese Communist Party, they increase the channels of communication between the society and the government. So although the Chinese political system, according to the theory of Chinese socialist democracy, so in the Western liberal democracy, the system is multi-party system, regularly competed in election. There should be a separation of power for check and balance. In Chinese political system, it is the opposite. That outside we call that CCP dictatorship, but inside China it is called CCP leadership. Instead of separation of power, the CCP leadership pursues integration of power for the unity and harmonious society. So that is the theoretical justification of the system. But what is interesting is that Chinese Communist Party, they also envision that within this non-democratic system, non-democratic from our observation from the outside, Chinese leaders, they also imagine that it is possible to grow democratic features within non-democratic system by developing rule of laws regime. Chinese Communist Party invests a lot for legal professionalism. There are more law universities. They also establish a legal aid center to educate Chinese people to use laws to address their issues. And also there were many governance reform in consultation, like town hall meeting, where the people can have an opportunity to express their grievances or suggestions for policy making. And also there was an explosive increase of Chinese non-governmental organizations. As long as you don't really work on human rights or political opposition, then the party gives a lot of opportunities for the civil societies, civil organizations to address issues like non-political issues like poverty, education, or public health. So there was a lot of governance reform policies that increased the space for democratic features. And these are some examples of the governance reform that constitute the resilience of the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian system. So at the lowest level of governance, at the village level, the party allows village election so that village residents, they can elect their leaders. And also with Chinese Communist Party's initiative to increase the space for civil society, European unions or American NGOs, they also find opportunities to work with Chinese counterparts. And even the Chinese government was willing to talk about human rights issues. There were even 24 times of human rights dialogue between China and the UK government in 2017. So that strategy to strengthen governance reform, by doing so strengthen the performance legitimacy of the party, get some success, that Chinese people think that their country became more democratic compared to its past. China is far from democracy from the standard of Western liberal democracy, but at least within Chinese Communist Party's history, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao's administration was much more open and democratic compared to Mao Zedong's time. The problem is that so when there is an opening in the political system with less censorship and giving more local initiative, giving more power to private sector, so the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy has increased. Like a T1 is like a Deng Xiaoping error, T2 is like Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin error, and when it gets to T3, the people they increasingly support the CCP's regime legitimacy as the country more opens. But the legitimacy also goes starting to down because people start to also challenge the central authority of the party. They gather, they have more opportunities to express their grievances, and then their grievances are elevated to the central level. And some people start to say that we need to change our political system. And that partly explains why the party retightened its control over the society. So there was as Chinese Communist Party liberalized its policies, then there was more protest from the society. And after Xi Jinping took power, there is no clear data how much the protests increased. But by anecdotal evidence, we know that there is an increasing trend. What are the issues that Chinese people are protesting about? Feminism or environmental issues or at the rural area, the villagers, they also protest about the local corruption. And this is the picture of the Chinese veterans in uniform. They don't gather here to crack down all these protests. They also gather in front of the PLA headquarters to argue, to demand more welfare policies for their post-service welfare programs. So Chinese politics, so I spent about 10 minutes just to explain this one point, that Chinese politics is not as stable as they say or we look from the outside. And when people say that Kim Jong-un, you can start economic development and then you can still maintain your political stability as much as China has been. And then this is what we're going to get once you start economic development. And of course, from Kim Jong-un's perspective, this is not tolerable. that people gather. If you can imagine that North Korean people, they are allowed to address their daily issues like that. When they are allowed to gather, then of course they will speak about, they will share their complaints about the regime, and then Kim Jong-un cannot take the risk. And then there is a reason, then there is a question, why Chinese Communist Party still could take this risk of economic reform, but why North Korea could not? So that's the main, actually, the main question that we like to discuss. But let's look back what actually North Korea tried for economic reform and opening in comparison with Chinese experience of economic reform. So Deng Xiaoping started its economic reform program with the liberalization in rural area and marketization and privatization, giving more private companies to exercise to develop their business, and also give more power to local governments to experiment with economic programs. And then in order to implement this economic reform, it cannot be done without political reform as well. So giving more power to local governments and private sector also means that the Chinese Communist Party, they have to relax their control over the society by giving more power to the private sector and then local governments. And also, politics should be more predictable to provide more stable environment for business. China cannot over another cultural revolution if that wants to focus on economic development. So Deng Xiaoping also implemented political reform that is necessary to succeed in economic reform. So Deng Xiaoping introduced term limit or age limit to ensure the regular rotation of the leadership, and also Deng Xiaoping also followed by his successors Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. The trend of political reform was to divide the function of party and state, giving more opportunity for the government to develop expertise. And looking at the success of Chinese economic reform and opening, of course, Kim Jong-il also tried similar policies. In 2002, Kim Jong-il announced various measures of economic reform, which is very similar with North China's economic reform, giving more power to private sector, giving more decision-making authority to local government. And even Kim Jong-un as well, he also emphasized economic development as much as military capabilities. And the Kim Jong-un regime also collaborated with so-called Donju, the middle class who succeed in accumulating wealth. The problem is that the Kim family regime could not really implement the political reform that was very necessary for the success of economic reform. So instead of institutionalized, predictable power succession, North Korea continued hereditary succession from second generation of Kim Jong-il to third generation of Kim Jong-un. And then 2002 economic reform was reversed by 2009 currency reform, that the state government take over all the wealth accumulated by some middle class in North Korea. And also, instead of decentralization and liberalization, the Kim family regime just continued, if not reinforced, the reign by terror. So this is the story on the reform side. But what about economic opening side? Again, Deng Xiaoping conducted economic opening by designating Shenzhen and Shanghai as a special economic zone, and also encouraging partnership between local companies and foreign companies. The goal is to attract more foreign investment. And in all this process, the Chinese leaders hope that the local companies can learn foreign technologies from the partnership with foreign companies. So in order to succeed in these policies of economic opening, of course, there should be political opening as well. While Communist Party implement this economic opening, it cannot just stick to these old policies of emphasizing Maoism or communism only. So there should be a relaxation of ideological control, and then so that the party can signal to the society that it is okay for you to contact with foreigners, learn from them. There is nothing wrong with that. And then that's what actually Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin administration did. Their political rhetoric at the time is that China is humble and the country is ready to learn any good lessons from any countries, even including the West, which is very different from today's Xi Jinping's remarks, political rhetoric today. But there was that time that Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao, they encouraged students to go abroad. And as part of that process, they also relaxed ideological control compared to Mao Zedong's time. And they also welcome foreigners to come in to China and learn about Chinese language, Chinese culture, and then also encourage them to interact with Chinese. And looking at, again, the success of China's economic opening program, North Korea, again, also emulate Chinese policies. The Kim Jong-il regime introduced partnership law so that North Korean companies also have an opportunity to work with foreign companies. And also the North Korea, Pyongyang also designate Lajin and Seongbong as a special economic zone, emulating China's designation of special economic zone. And then also initiative with the South Korean initiative during Kim Dae-jung and Romeo administration, the Pyongyang was also interested in and willing to cooperate with South Korean government for the economic cooperation by designating Kaesong and Kumgangsan as a special economic zone for cooperation with the outside world, in this case, South Korea. Again, to succeed this economic openness, the Kim family regime should have also implemented some political openness. Otherwise, North Korean people, they cannot really have a meaningful interaction with the foreigners. But as we all know, Kim family could not do that. The Kim Jong-un regime doubled down, if not maintained, the closing system. And also the worst case of the detaining foreigners is the tragic incident with the Otto Windier, the American student who was detained by North Korean authorities and sadly, tragically died in prison. And then North Korea's legal system for economic and environment or for foreign investment is unpredictable still. That the politics always can intervene in the legal system. And from the perspective of foreign investors, North Korea is not really a good place that you want to put your assets. So the question is, so North Korea tried because they also want economic development, but they could not implement the political reform or openness that is necessary for the success of economic reform, while China could do that. In other words, China could take the risk of political effects from economic development, but North Korea could not. The reason is that from the beginning, Deng Xiaoping and then Kim Jong-il were Communist Party leaders, and Kim family regime has a different perspective about this political danger of the economic reform. So Deng Xiaoping famously said that when you open window, both fresh air and flies come in. Fresh air here means that money, investment, or the opportunity to learn foreign technology. The flies is like the effect of political liberalization that people, through the process of interaction with foreigners, they learn that how foreign countries criticize Chinese Communist Party's closed system. And then they may, some Chinese students or some Chinese citizens, they may be persuaded by the foreign rationale, foreign story, narrative about their country, and they may become more dissatisfied with their system. But even so, Deng Xiaoping's vision was that China's economy can grow out of those political danger. It is still, the political danger is still worth taking, whereas Kim Jong-il's case, that he said we should use a mosquito net to let fresh air in but block mosquitoes. And then why different? We can compare that the one common similarity between China and then Korean Peninsula's case is that those two countries are the ones that are still divided after the World War II. Of course, Chinese claim that China is a one country. It is Taiwan is still part of the country. It is a domestic issues. But even so, still there is a division. That's why there is an argument about unification. South Korea is the same. Then the assumption is that why Deng Xiaoping was not worried about the political effects about the demonstration of Taiwan as a liberal democracy. Well, when Deng Xiaoping started economic reform and open, of course, Chinese people may have an opportunity to learn about Taiwan's liberal democracy, but actually it is not. Taiwan's democratization started at the end of 1980s and early 1990s. Taiwan was still also under the dictatorship, military control of the Chiang Kai-shek regime. So Deng Xiaoping can claim that Taiwan is also under the dictatorship, manipulated by the US imperialists. So the China's narrative about Taiwan can sustain. And also there was no internet, or the sheer size of China's population and territory is no match to Taiwan. But when Kim Jong-il wanted to implement economic reform and open in the early 1990s, South Korea was already developed and democratized. And then also the technology also enables more penetration of outside information into North Korea. And also compared to the size between China and Taiwan, South Korea has a larger population and its economic size is incomparable to North Korea's economic size. So North Korea could not really take the risk of outside information entering North Korea systematically. North Korean people already knows. Many people, according to the testimony by North Korean defectors, many North Korean residents, they already know that South Korea is democratized and much more developed. But even so, the Kim family regime cannot officially acknowledge that or allow people to talk about that by implementing political reform and openness. Because every country has its own state narrative, that the state narrative of the US for the regime legitimacy of American liberal democracy is that, so America was built by immigrants from Europe who came to the new land in search of democracy and human rights, and then democracy and human rights has increased over the history of the United States. That's the state narrative. South Korea's state narrative is that South Korea was weak and it was once colonized by external powers, invaded, but now modern South Korea has succeeded in industrialization and even democratization. So that gives, that's the story that students learn from the state system about South Korea. What about North Korea? What is state narrative of North Korea? North Korea has nothing to, it doesn't have much to show off about industrialization or democratization. The state narrative of North Korea is that North Korean people are so pure and they are innocent, but they are always surrounded by imperialists and jackals or the predators outside. And then Kim family regime is protecting this innocence of North Korean people. And then the jackal outside used to be Japanese before, Chinese before, and now it is the United States Yankees. And then South Korea is under the puppet of American imperialism. So that's the state narrative. And then Kim Jong-un regime, Kim family regime cannot take the risk of destroying the state narrative by implementing economic reform and open because there is a story of South Korea. If there was no South Korea, then let's assume that North Korea somehow won the war, the Korean War in 1950. And then Korea was already unified by war, like Vietnam, after the Vietnam War. So Korea was, the whole Korea was unified under communism for 70 years. There is no South Korea, then I assume that Kim Jong-un, Kim family regime has much less risk of implementing economic reform open. But with South Korea's success story in industrialization and democratization, it is so dangerous and risky for Kim Jong regime to conduct economic reform and opening. So compared to China's case, so if it is true that North Korea could not conduct economic reform and opening, not only because of sanctions or security threat from the United States, but more fundamentally because of this contradiction between political stability and economic growth, then we can assume that it will be very hard for the Kim family regime to make positive change toward reform and opening or denuclearization or peace negotiation. It is not about external factors. It is about internal contradiction that prevents Kim family regime from conducting any meaningful economic reform and opening. So if that is the logical assumption that we can get after my arguments before, then what change? The only change we can expect from the North Korean regime is on the negative side. It will be the extreme contingency at the leadership level, or coup d'etat, or popular uprising. Of course, given the North Korea's closed system, it is highly unlikely that North Korean people they can protest against the regime. But relatively, coup d'etat may be more likely, but still, there is a very tight surveillance system, even for the North Korean elites. And then the only remaining contingency is the removal of the top leader, Kim Jong-un in this case. And that's the story of all this discussion about so-called contingency scenario. So from 2009, there was a series of contingency scenario reports produced by the US think tank or South Korean think tank. And Kim Jong-un showed his resilience, and he still stays in power, and his power looks very stable. So the scenarios is getting narrow, that the only remaining scenario for the contingency is the assassination of Kim Jong-un. But that kind of event is so unpredictable. So that kind of scenario is not really discussed deeply, and also it is very politically dangerous and sensitive. So not many people really discuss. But for the sake of intellectual discussion, let's assume that someday, if somehow this kind of extreme situation, that Kim Jong-un is somehow removed from the power, then it is really unpredictable that how the contingency at the top can quickly elevate to the larger chaos in North Korea. So my intent is not to argue that there will be a contingency or there will be which scenario is has more likelihood. The whole point I want to emphasize with this scenario development is that we need to worry about implosion of North Korea, not North Korea's first attack of South Korea. The other argument I can make is that as much as we worry about North Korea's potential attack on South Korea or US allies, at the same time, we also need to worry about the implosion, some domestic problems, contingency that starts from domestic politics within North Korea. Because if something happens within North Korea, how the US, China responds to this contingency makes a lot of difference, that it can quickly enter another second Korean War, or of course we want to go through this unpredictable, dangerous period by closely discussing and then exchanging ideas that what are their goals on the Korean Peninsula, what kind of end state they want to see. So there is still always a need for Washington, Beijing, Tokyo, and South Korea to talk about this issue. Of course, it is very difficult in today's environment, in the era of strategic competition between US and China. But even so, we can still explore Chinese thinking about Korean unification, and then I'll finish this part within 5 minutes. I already spent a lot of time. So China's official position about Korean unification is that from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, they consistently say that China is ready to support national unification of Korean people as long as its process is peaceful and independent. Peaceful means that without Second Korean War, and if there is such a war, then China should intervene because of the possibility of large exodus of refugees or the instability on the Korean Peninsula. By independent, what Chinese mean by independent is that unified Korea should be neutral. It should, the US versus Korea should leave. Otherwise, China will be exposed to the security threat from US versus Korea on the unified Korea. But does it mean that what if the unification process is not really peaceful? What if the US versus Korea is likely to remain on the Korean Peninsula after unification? Does it mean that China will really fight another Korean War, or China is ready to annex North Korea like Putin is trying to annex Ukraine today? So there is a lot of this question. And this is popular image that you can find on the internet. What is China's plan about unification of Korea? And then I try to trace back the source of this image, that how China plans to divide North Korea into 4 sectors, and then each country, each stakeholder take over each part. The source of this information is going back to some Japanese scholar who make this argument based upon his long study of Chinese politics. So there is no official document, of course, that envision this Chinese thinking. Because it is such a sensitive topic, it is very hard for researchers to decipher what is China thinking about the unification. My methodology was that still there are many scholarly works that discuss Korean unification. I use this Chinese website that search Chinese scholarly works, and I input the word Korean Peninsula and unification to collect Chinese articles about that discuss Korean unification. And then some people will argue that those scholarly works, written by Chinese scholars, are not really meaningful because there is a censorship. There is no value that we can get from the Chinese civilian writings. Ironically, my argument is that they are still useful information precisely because of the censorship. Let's say within the Communist Party, they discuss the range of ideas from 1 to 10. 1 and 10 representing very extreme ideas. That 1, for example, if Korea is unified, then we will just give Korean Peninsula to the US. We will not worry about Korean Peninsula anymore. Number 10 is another extreme idea, is that we will never allow unified Korea to be under the influence of the US. So we would rather fight another Korean War. So those extreme ideas, some Chinese scholars, they may have that idea, but they are so sensitive, they cannot write that in public, even though within the party, some people may discuss such an idea. At least what are allowed to publish means that Communist Party, they also have discussed this idea within the party. That's why the party can allow scholars, okay, you can write about this and publish that, because we already have this discussion, and this is the range that you can safely publish. So by looking at what Chinese scholars write, we can also look into not the entire breadth of the Chinese Communist Party thinking, but some of them for sure. So I gathered this 69 articles, and then I read and I summarize my findings, that the potential cost of Korean unification, or what benefits China can expect from the unification in the security sector, diplomacy and economy, and domestic politics. For all the details, I don't have time to go through. I recommend you to take a look at my article. There is a nice table that summarizes my findings. but still we have to discuss the most sensitive issue for China when it comes to unification of Korea, which is US versus Korea after unification. So if North Korea is somehow gone and then there is a unification process, then we can easily imagine that many American people want to bring back their sons and daughters from the Korean Peninsula. But some people would still argue that Korean US forces should be there to balance China's influence. So American public opinion will be divided to bring back US forces to Korea or keep them. Likewise, South Korean public opinion will be also divided that now Korea is unified, we don't need external forces of US forces Korea. Or some people will argue that, well, we still have a potential threat from China and even Japan. We want you to have as a stabilizer or a balancer, even after unification. So when Korean people and American people, they together want to leave, they together want US forces Korea to leave, then of course it is an easy decision for Washington and Seoul. US forces Korea will leave immediately. But if American public wants to bring back US forces Korea, or South Korean people want to keep them, it is still easier for Beijing to see, because if Beijing and Washington, they have the same opinion to bring back US forces Korea, they can ignore the public opinion of South Korea, because in the end, its decision is made by Washington. So the preference of from Chinese perspective is that the uncertainty about US versus Korea's status, that American people want to keep them and then Korean people want to see them leave, and then there will be a political tension between Washington and Seoul, and then there will be a phased leave, and China would pressure Washington and Seoul to finish the leaving process as early as possible. The worst case scenario is that both American public opinion and Seoul want to keep US versus Korea. So what will be China's response to in this scenario? For the scenario one, China does not need to take any action. They just welcome, this is really great. Or in the scenario two, that America wants to bring back US forces Korea, then Beijing can make a deal with Washington. It is uncertain that the US forces Korea to stay for a long time, or if they want to stay forever. What will be China's response to this kind of scenario? Again, many people assume, and I agree that within the party, some people will argue that, well, that's the reality, we have to live with US versus Korea. Or some other people on the other extreme will argue that we will never allow this situation, we have to fight the war. But when I read Chinese scholars' articles that was written and published in open sources, I was even more surprised by this idea that Chinese scholars, they envision that US versus Korea after unification, during the unification process, they will focus on securing North Korea's weapons of mass destruction. They will be the first priority. And then US versus Korea will also be part of multinational forces under the UN headquarters to manage the unification process in a stable manner. And that is also beneficial for China's interest. So there is a space for PLA and US versus Korea to cooperate for the goal of securing WMD and also managing the unification process stable. If US versus Korea, the bilateral alliance somehow evolves to or helps to create multilateral security architecture in Northeast Asia. There was a six-party talks, it did not work. But without North Korea, unification process may enable the creation of security architecture in Northeast Asia. That's what some Chinese scholars write. Of course, there are many other Chinese scholars say that we cannot trust Washington. We have to be worried about military conflict with the US. But at the same time, they didn't say that we have to fight the war, but they are worried. But at the same time, there are other Chinese scholars who also envision potential cooperation. So the point is that it is also, we cannot put all of our eggs to the goodwill of Beijing, but at the same time, that does not mean that we have to assume the worst case scenario from Beijing. We have to have a good understanding of the broad range of China's cost-benefit calculus. so that we can negotiate and engage more productively with Beijing. So that's the vision from perspective from China. And again, this is the last slide, I promise. What about the US side? So what will be the US defense priorities when the unification process starts? The first priority will be the securing North Korea's nuclear and WMD sites, and also stabilizing the domestic politics. And there is no document that the US is planning to take over North Korean territory or to pursue rapid unification, even when there is a Kim Jong-un regime. All this unification process will start. Somehow North Korea agrees or North Korea is gone. How do we know that? So in 2017, December, then Secretary of State Tillerson appeared in the public event organized by Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. And then there was a rare moment that he also mentioned about the U.S. cooperation with China about handling North Korea problems. And then it was reported widely in public media, so I can cite that. For example, Mr. Tillerson said that the U.S. authorities are having conversation with China about the contingency in North Korea, and then the priority will be securing those nuclear weapons that does not fall into the wrong hands. And then he also added that we have conversation with Chinese about how this might be done, that U.S. forces Korea may enter cross the dividing line between North and South Korea. But he also guarantees Beijing that once the goal of securing the WMD, then the U.S. forces Korea will be returned to the South Korean part. The U.S. has no interest in staying and taking over the North Korean territory. So there is overlap between what Chinese scholars envision and also what American scholars and officials also envision about the unification process. First is security WMD, and then stability first before competing for the influence. So to summarize, so I guess my argument is that North Korea could not implement meaningful economic reform and open, not because of external factors, but more fundamentally because of internal contradiction between economic development and political control. Even if North Korea is given an opportunity, that North Korea cannot take risk of conducting economic reform and openness, they will bring in some political instability. And then Chinese interests are negotiable depending on how the US and South Korea works. So with that, I'll wrap up my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cho, for that very wide-ranging presentation. I think we could have spent the whole hour just on the fourth section on Chinese views of Korean Peninsula unification. So we have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So maybe we can collect a few questions from the audience. Both virtually, we have a few queued up as well as in person. Does anyone from the in-person audience have a question like that? I'll go straight to our large group online. So we have a few questions. Some of them have to do with a part that you skipped over due to time, but asking about Chinese views of the economic aspects of Korean Peninsula unification. So what do Chinese scholars think about that in terms of the potential consequences for a reunified Korea and what that might mean for China?
Well, if Korea is unified, then Chinese have to worry about their existing investment in North Korea's minerals or their leasing of the port and also the fishing rights that somehow North Korean regime has already conceded on a wide range of areas. So that will be disputed that the government of unified Korea or South Korea government would want to negotiate that those contracts or agreements should be readjusted because it was made during the previous regime. Here we assume that Korean unification has somehow happened after Kim Jong-un regime is born, or if there is an alternative regime. But the benefit is that from the perspective of China's economic development, so the coastal area has developed very fast, whereas the inland western part has been relatively poor compared to the coastal area. So from Hu Jintao government, Chinese government wants to make a balance of the balanced development of the provinces, and then the northeastern provinces that Heilongjiang and Liaoning provinces, they are also relatively poor compared to the coastal areas. So Hu Jintao government also tries to invest a lot and revitalize those three northeastern provinces of China, and then it did not really work well. And then Chinese scholars in their writing, they expect that once Korea is unified, there will be huge investment in the development of North Korea, following the right rules and principles of market economy. And also there will be increase of trade between developed North Korea and then three provinces through South Korea. So in the end, the so-called Changjitu area, the three provinces of China will have a better opportunity for economic development. So that's another positive side that Chinese scholars can expect.
We have a couple of more questions from online. One has to do with the increasingly important role of science and technology in growth and economic success. So the question asker is wondering, what is North Korea currently trying to do to advance its capabilities in science and technology? Can you share a little bit about that?
They have advanced technology on the negative side of hackering and also exploiting the space created by all this Bitcoin, cyber money, and also espionage. So on that side, North Korea has impressed many researchers about this advanced technology, and also on the development of nuclear and missile technology. North Korea shows its potential to learn and develop advanced technology once given an opportunity for the positive changes. But as we all know, the regime's priority is not really on the economic development with technology, or positive technology, but more on the regime survival by investing in the negative side. So it is a story state that we are living in today, that the potential of North Korean people are not really materialized. But yet again, to this question, I would say North Korea still shows potential, great potential that it can succeed in technological learning and development.
Please.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I haven't really thought about how Chinese experts are thinking about sort of the post-unification period in some ways. And I'm just wondering, I guess there's sort of a two-part. But one is, when we think about the fall of the Soviet Union and NATO and then recent invasion of Ukraine, like a lot of people talk about how there was this window period, in the late 90s, or early 90s, mid 90s, where there might have been more sort of cooperation, expansion of NATO, or these kinds of things. But actually, it ended up that both positions, they were just too suspicious of each other. They just really wanted to take advantage of the moment and maximize their own advantages. And so isn't there that sort of danger on both sides in a moment of sort of crisis, that even though they might have these contingency plans, ultimately they're going to try to sort of maximize their kind of advantage? And the other just follow-up to that is your analysis sort of changed given the way U.S.-China relations have progressed over the past 6 months to a year, just with Xi Jinping and Tillerson is like a long time ago now, right? In terms of how the State Department and U.S. foreign policy might be thinking about any kind of conflict.
Just to repeat briefly for the folks online, the first question was about if there's a window opportunity logic that might be operating here. And then the second one was, has your analysis changed in terms of recent changes in U.S.-China relations over the last year, for example?
Yes. So because the U.S. and China's relationship has been, their rivalry has become more increasingly intensive, there is less reason for Beijing to help Washington's initiative about controlling North Korea's provocations. So that's why North Korea conducted ICBM tests from last year. Beijing did not really agree to pass another UN resolution to press North Korea. So to your observation, because the U.S.-China relationship is not as good as before, so China does not help. And even there is an argument, which actually I make in my foreign affairs piece, North Korean provocation is consequentially helping China's security environment by distracting the U.S. defense focus on Taiwan contingency or China's overall. So North Korea can suck the attention and resources of U.S. defense departments. So to that degree, China may welcome, or if not they actively encourage, but at least they may not oppose North Korea's further provocations. That said, still, compared to, many scholars, even Chinese, agree that if the U.S. and China, they ever go to war or military conflict, it will not be in Latin America or in Africa. It will be one of four flash areas: Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, East China Sea, or Korean Peninsula. If they ever fight a war, it will be one of these four hot points. Then compared to Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, East China Sea, that China claims as their part of their territory, Korean Peninsula is clearly not. So compared to all those, all the other areas, Korean Peninsula still has some space for negotiation at the worst case compared to other cases. And that gives some possibility that Beijing may use the crisis on the Korean Peninsula as a breakthrough to improve the relationship with the US. But this contingency should be really, really extreme, that even China cannot control anymore, which is the implosion of domestic politics. That's the only case that Chinese will think that, okay, there is nothing I can really help. I would rather use this as an opportunity to work with the US because we have a common goal of stability of the Korean Peninsula. Compared to Taiwan Strait, China cannot really concede South China Sea. So ironically, still Korean Peninsula is relatively a place for negotiation for Washington and Beijing.
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Even if North Korea established more than 20 special economic zones, it was not very successful, in part because China's lack of cooperation. And we remember in early 2000, when North Korea is trying to establish the Sinŭiju special economic zone, China actually arrested the minister, who were appointed by North Korea to kind of suppress the initiative. So given this new international environment, do you think China may now support North Korea's focus on economic development differently from all the policies?
That 2000, what year was that Yang Min was arrested? That still remains as a big mystery, as you say, why Chinese were not really helping the economic development. North Korea's experiment with Sinŭiju at the time. So I don't have a good answer for that, which is even more mysterious, given thinking about given Chinese leaders, their consistent message to Kim family regime that you should do economic reform and open as we do, and we are ready to support. It did not at Yang Min's case, but that's the message by far. Even Xi Jinping still talks about that. So there is a rhetoric that China is ready to support North Korea's Chinese-style economic reform and open, and then there is a mystery of how much China actually allocate resources to support North Korea's economic reform and open. But we know that China also allocate huge resources to support North Korea's economic survival by providing food and energy support as an aid, not really as a form of investment. So we have to see that when Kim Jong-un is truly, although my analysis is pessimistic, that Kim Jong-un can voluntarily really implement meaningful economic reform and open, but we have to see when Kim Jong-un really does that, then what China can bring, what China can offer. But at least for now, it is true that we know that China is providing aids and food and fuel to keep North Korean regime survive.
So we have another question from the online audience kind of asking about the North Korean side of the equation. So you focused on Chinese views of North Korea, but they point out that trust between China and North Korea is often understood to be low. So do you think that North Korea understands what Chinese thinking is? And if so, do you think there are concerns or problems?
I hope when I publish this article, the title of the article is that the Chinese perspective of the Korean Unification in 2021. I hope North Korean scholars somehow download it and also they should be interested, I assume. So North Korea researchers community, they are so familiar with this fact that North Korean people do not really trust Chinese, or it is not really well understood, taken outside this community in the US or outside. Why North Korea develops nuclear weapon? Why is it so obsessed with a nuclear weapon? First, because it feels threatened by the US versus Korea or security threat from US allies. That's a conventional wisdom. But even more broadly and even more importantly, because North Korea does not trust that Beijing will provide security protection, that's why North Korea needs its self-help to protect itself. It's a nuclear weapon. So when there was a Soviet Union detente with the Washington near the end of Cold War, and also when Beijing normalized its diplomatic relationship with Seoul in 1992, despite Kim Il-sung's repeated requests, just wait until we normalize our relationship with the US first. But Deng Xiaoping made decision that no, we go first. That was the point that North Korea was totally isolated. There is no Soviet sponsor. China cannot be trusted. So nuclear weapon is the only way that it can guarantee its own survival, if necessary, even using that against the PLA. Of course, in a very extremely hypothetical situation. So that answers to this question that to what degree North Koreans trust or distrust. The development of nuclear weapon itself is an evidence that North Korea cannot really trust upon the Beijing's goodwill.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cho, for your time today, and to the audience for their great questions.